Hello, welcome to History in Lowell. I'm Maritza Grooms. I'm here with my favorite professor, Bob Forrant.
Yay for me.
Yay for both of us. It's always such a treat. So we've been talking about a lot of different things, and some of what we do is uncovering Lowell's story that hasn't been told, part of it, right? So I'm really excited about today, especially because we're matching, and it just fits our theme so perfectly.
Yep, and we didn't even chat beforehand.
No, it's just the synergy that we share.
Yes.
So today we're going back to the 1930s, 1940s.
20s and 30s.
Yep, 20s and 30s.
And 40s.
And 40s. We're just going back
Those three
to the
middle decades.
yeah, the middle of the 20th century, right? So what's happening around that time? Let's remind the audience what's going on.
So big picture, late 1920s, early 1930s in Lowell, and actually pretty much around the world, we're in the midst of the Great Depression.
Yes.
The economy has pretty much collapsed everywhere. Thousands and thousands of people have lost their jobs. About 45% of all households in Lowell, nobody's working. We've pretty much exhausted relief in any way at all. And 1932 presidential election, big change. We go from 3 Republican presidential administrations to the election of Franklin Roosevelt and a largely Democratic Congress begin to institute significant social reforms to try to deal with the catastrophe of the Great Depression. At the same time, the world is, I never want to say a war is inevitable, but it seems almost inevitable. We're on a collision course. World War I has ended in 1918. There's a peace treaty, but doesn't make anybody happy on any side, and almost immediately after the peace deal is signed, it starts to be broken and disrupted. And by the mid-1930s, Europe is pretty much at war. Hitler has been expanding his efforts in Germany and then in larger Eastern Europe to round up and commit, vast atrocities on Jewish population. He's invaded Poland eventually during this period of time. And in the United States, we are remaining neutral. And Franklin Roosevelt's trying to figure out what to do. But as that progresses in 1941, since we're actually doing the show on Veterans Day, Armistice Day, in December of 1941, most people know December 7th, Pearl Harbor in Hawaii is attacked, and the next day Franklin Roosevelt goes to Congress and gets a declaration of war, and we've now full-on engaged in what we know of in the history books as the Second World War.
Wow, so it's a scary time, and probably everybody is in a panic, a mad rush. People are being drafted. Well, men are being drafted, right?
Right.
And then we have these big giant mills that are kind of like a ghost town right now because of the Depression.
Yep.
So how does that change?
So what happens is, people like my dad, who's 18 at the time, next day after declaration of war at the draft board, he's at his draft board in Beverly, Mass, where he grew up, where I grew up. He's enlisting, and so that follows a trajectory for hundreds and hundreds of thousands of young men. And what that does is create this really complex dilemma, because what also has to happen once we've entered the war is we need stuff. We need the stuff of war. We need uniforms. We need boots. We need blankets.
Yeah.
We need bullets. We need planes. We need tanks. And because the American industrial economy has been sliding downward in the Great Depression, and it's never really fully recovered, we're really not in any way, shape, or form able to meet what is really going to be required in terms of industrial output. And we have all these jobs that people who are drafted or enlist vacate, and now we have the beginnings of trying to build this military industrial complex, but without a traditional, I'll put that in quotes, workforce. And so this causes this interesting dilemma for the country to try to deal with.
Yeah, because not everybody was working at that time. It was only mostly men that were working. And before that, we knew heavy immigrant huge immigrant populations were working. But at this time, it was just the men bringing in the money for the most part. So who's going to make all this stuff?
Right, well, that's the question, right? And that gets put before the American people. And again, you sort of, I find like stereotypes in the way people typecast and things really fascinating in history, because up until this moment, the idea of a woman working on an assembly line building an automobile was unthinkable, or the idea of a woman working in a factory making jet engines for airplanes, or actually making airplane wings, or doing any of that sort of skilled metal work, machining work, that type of thing. It's like, no, you know, that's not women's work, right? But
well,
now
these fingers are too dainty to touch metal.
You can't do it. It's too heavy. It's
too rigorous.
Whatever. It's too dirty. It's too hot.
We're just not capable.
Right. Exactly. Right. But now, okay, so now you have all these jobs. And you have actually a growth in jobs, because to actually meet the war production needs, you need multiples more of workers than you even had before.
Oh boy.
And so there's approximately 10 million women still working in the country in 1942.
Wow.
In textile mills. And so in Lowell, there could be a shoe mill that instead of having 1,000 workers has a couple hundred, and most of those workers would be women. But what happens now is, across the country, the call goes out for women to take these precision machining, metalworking, manufacturing sorts of jobs that up until this point have been sort of out of bounds for women to even apply, and let alone get the job.
Suddenly, the doors have opened. There is access.
Yes.
And we're ready to show what we can prove and serve this country too,
Exactly.
right? So we go to work.
You go to work, and in a way you're going to war at the same time. So there's a lot of quotes from women who end up in these jobs saying, we couldn't go, they wouldn't let us go fight, we couldn't go fight, so this was the next best thing. So we felt like we were in the war by engaging in this sort of manufacturing activity. And again, it's stark how, right, I mean, again, the way this works always boggles my mind. So in December of 1941, women are not capable of doing this work. By March of 1942, not only are the 10 million women, not all of them are engaged in this, but many of them are, but an additional 6 million women have flooded into the labor market to do these jobs. And so, again, this kind of stereotype, and I should say that what also happens is these jobs as well open up to African American workers, both male and female, which traditionally had been out of bounds as well. Those jobs would have largely been segregated and been the provenance of white skilled men. And so no women, no African American workers, no Puerto Rican workers or Mexican workers, or now that all changes. And so in the midst of the labor shortage, what had been these hard and fast rules, become rules no more.
Well, when it's not just, us, when it's not just us, we're needed, right? The marginalized are actually useful.
Yep. And so the federal government launches this campaign, and they basically start marketing this idea of Rosie the Riveter. And there's a song that gets written called Rosie the Riveter. And in order to promote, they basically make these newsreel films that people will see when they go to the movies in Lowell on Saturday, or Lawrence or Haverhill or wherever. And there'll be a clip, the song will play, and then there'll be women like welding on a automobile assembly line, or building a tank, or doing whatever it would be. And they would find women who they would promote then as the Rosie the Riveters, right? And they would all have a certain look. There's a very famous poster where a woman's standing, the woman's like that,
anything.
right? Yeah, exactly, right. So, and kind of like a Yes We Can from the 1940s, and there's a heavy emphasis placed on making this happen. And in Lowell, because there are so many empty mills or half-full mills, lots of manufacturers, General Electric and lots of other companies, start setting up shop in Lowell. Lots of shoe factories in Lowell that are dormant largely get these big contracts to make boots.
Yeah.
And then more women come back. And right where we're talking, for people that don't know, where we're filming is on Market Street in downtown Lowell. A block over from where we were doing this was this gigantic factory that made parachutes. And there were 1,000 women in there making parachutes. They held the record for making the most parachutes in a week.
Wow.
Throughout the war, and they got all these certificates and commendations from the federal government.
Lowell women blow my mind every single time.
No, it's fascinating to sort of see how much it's transformative. And then once I started learning more about this, I went and I started reading more oral histories of some of these women who did the work, and they talk about making, before these jobs, they were making, the most they might be able to make is $25 or $30 a week.
Wow.
They go into this parachute company and they're starting at $100 a week, which is big time money.
Yeah.
Back then, and again, in some cases, their primary breadwinner, again, in the old model of like men work and women stay home, whatever, is now fighting, and they're the breadwinner. Right. What also is interesting is, the more I dug into this, childcare.
Yeah, that's my next question.
The company set childcare up.
Get out of here.
On site.
Wow. So they're capable of doing it.
Oh yeah.
When we need it.
When the need smashes you in the face,
Oh,
you figure out a way to
goodness.
deal with it, right? And if it was not in a building, the city would do it, or whatever. There would be like a local childcare in an area where everybody was going. And so, because sometimes women were working like 11 p.m. to 7 a.m., these war factories in Lowell and elsewhere in the country were working around the clock. And so this became a challenge again, right? But out of the necessity comes this capacity, this capability to do it, which again, after the war is over, that all goes away. Right? Well, it's too hard to do. Well, no, you just did it.
Yeah.
And did it well for 4 years. So you can't now say you can't do it. But
Right. So what's the real reasoning? We might have to get the philosopher back in here.
maybe. I mean, but the thing of it is, which is really fascinating, is so again, most historians would agree that the Allies won the war because of this production. That D-Day, with all the planes and the landing ships and all the stuff had to be made, and women played a gigantic role in making this stuff. However, at the same time as all that was happening, as women were getting hired in these industries, some companies, and in some cases unions as well, had them sign agreements that when the war ended, they had to quit.
Of course. Bliss only lasts but so long.
Right. And so, that's what happened. And so 1945, when the war is over, in June of 45, then as people begin to come back and whatever, everybody has to sort of, all these women that have now made more money than they quite imagined they could have ever made, and also did jobs that are much more intricate and interesting and have a lot more skill, career possibilities attached to them or whatever, now have to leave those occupations and sort of retreat into the home again. And so it's sort of an interesting social story, because then in the 50s, all the sort of propaganda that comes out is a woman's place is in the home, and Dr. Spock, this is how you raise your kid, and whatever.
Don't forget,
whatever.
You were good in the factories, but this is really where you're best served.
But this is where you'd be better off.
Yeah, that's ridiculous. But even more ridiculous is that there was a giant parachute company right there, and we don't know about it.
1,000 workers.
And we have no idea. So we all know about the mill girls, we know about the mill workers, but we don't know about women in Lowell and their role in this.
Yep. So we need somebody to write a short story or something called Parachute Girls.
That would be awesome.
To run up against the Mill Girl story.
Yeah.
And say the ancestors of the Mill Girls are Parachute Girls. I don't like using the word girls, but I'm used to
I know.
But anyway.
For all intents and purposes, right?
Yeah.
But we always talk about, uncovering that history, right? So here we are in a place where we celebrate history, Lowell being like such an integral part of the birth of this
That's
nation.
how I make my living.
Right, exactly. And again, here's another thing we don't know about Lowell's history. there are so many important women that come from here, and we don't see their names all over these buildings or on our street names or anything like that. So tell me more about some women who we should know about.
So again, in keeping with the theme of the day and what we're doing, Edith Nourse Rogers, who's a Lowellian, who becomes the first woman elected to the House of Representatives from Massachusetts.
A Lowellian.
A Lowellian.
The first.
Yep. And first one elected from Massachusetts to the House of Representatives, is in Congress in the 1930s. And so amongst other things, so she goes into Congress in the late 1920s. In 1932, there's this famous incident that doesn't get much, famous to me, but doesn't get much play in the history books, where veterans from the First World War, since we're talking about Armistice Day and everything, veterans from the First World War are promised a bonus by the federal government for having been in uniform during the First World War. However, they can't get that bonus until 1945. So we're now in the midst of the Great Depression, as we were talking about earlier, and a lot of these guys are down and out. They haven't had work for a while. They want their money. And so in April of 1932, they organize around the country a march on Washington to demand their bonus. And they decide to create a camp in Washington, D.C., to camp out for the summer of 1932 to demand the bonus.
Wow.
And Edith Nourse Rogers is in Congress now. And the Senate, the House and the Senate reject paying them the bonus. And the President of the United States, Herbert Hoover, calls on the U.S. military to evict military veterans from their encampment in Washington, D.C., and they burn the encampment down. There's men, women, and children in the encampment. A couple people lose their lives, but it's a very violent confrontation. And this is seen around the country in movie houses because newsreel cameras are there and they film it. You can find, if anybody watching wants to find out more, if you go online and you just Google the Bonus Army, you'll find footage of the military being used against the military in Washington, D.C.
Oh my gosh.
At any rate, as the war is winding down, 1944, Edith Rogers writes the first draft of a bill to make sure the same thing isn't replayed at the end of the Second World War. What we've come to know is the GI Bill. And she's one of the major architects. Again, there's nothing around that says it. There's no, Edith Nourse Rogers Mill Complex or sign or
War
plaque
Memorial
or whatever.
Yeah, anything.
And so the bill, most historians agree that the bill becomes instrumental in the creation, if you will, of the American middle class.
Wow.
When the war winds down, because amongst other things in the bill, anybody in uniform coming back that wants to go to college can go for free. Free college. Oh my God,
what a
the world's going to end. Free college. And so veterans coming back from the war can go to college, and about half of all the returning vets either go 2-year technical school or a regular 4-year institution. And it also creates funds so that people coming back can get a really cheap, low-interest, guaranteed mortgage to buy a house.
Wow.
And so those two things stimulate the economy, because again, people are worried about, okay, well, we've had the Great Depression, everything tumbles into the dumpster. Now we've had all this war production, which has generated all these jobs and this sort of massive production capacity, but the war's over, all those military contracts will end. What's going to happen? Well, you delay the entry of millions of people into the workforce by having them go to school, and you stimulate the housing economy by creating the wherewithal for millions of people who wouldn't be able to buy a house to buy a house, and now inside every one of those houses you need a new stove, a new refrigerator, furniture, and it stimulates all those other domestic industries. As opposed to making guns and bullets, now you make sofas and chairs and dining room tables and toilet seats and sinks and whatever, right? And it's ingenious. It's really, really brilliant.
It really is.
And so then the country embarks on roughly 30 years of basically growing prosperity. This is what economists would call a virtuous circle, right? All boats are rising, everybody's getting better. People, and so for me, my dad, who goes to the war, comes back, and he's able to buy a house, which he wouldn't have been able to do otherwise.
Wow.
And so I grow up in, like a mom and pop house with, my own bedroom and a picket fence and whatever, right? And millions of other people do as well. And so in Lowell, again, that stimulates home building, and that, again, puts lots of people back to work. And in Lowell, one of the repercussions of it is Lowell Textile Institute, which is now part of UMass Lowell, that explodes with returning veterans who go there and do plastics research and chemistry and physics and do all these things. And so all the great public universities, like in Michigan and Wisconsin and California and Massachusetts and Ohio, all those big public universities explode after the war is over, because now all these returning, they don't have enough dorms. Instead of dorms, kids are sleeping in tents.
Wow.
They can't build dorms fast enough.
Oh my goodness. I don't think you would see that now, though.
No, but you can't. I mean, it's really, it's quite remarkable. And again, she's a major architect of this piece of legislation. She's also a Republican, which is interesting, because we don't think of Republicans as being publicly magnanimous.
Right, yeah.
But she is through and through, from trying to figure out how to get Jewish refugees into the country to thinking, okay, I don't want a replay of the army running another army out of town, so what are we going to do? And like nothing, right? I mean, she should be having an honorary degree from the university.
Yeah.
There should be something in City Hall. I mean, she should have a parade.
She really
she's
should.
really this incredible figure. And again, it fits into this flow in this period of time, and that what gets left out by leaving women's role in the manufacturing end of things, and then sort of this public face, this intellectual policy role, whatever, then when you make all of that invisible, it's just a tragedy to me in terms of the way we teach the history, that somehow you don't put these people in the middle of it all, because they were. And she's this really fascinating person.
Yeah.
But you could walk up to hundreds of people in downtown Lowell, hey, do you know who Edith Nourse Rogers? They would look at you like, dude, what are you talking about? But if you said Ladd and Whitney, they would, oh yeah, that's the monument in front of City Hall. Nothing against Ladd and Whitney, they should have that too, but.
Well, they know the men of Lowell, but they don't know the women's names of Lowell.
What gets remembered and what doesn't get remembered is a really interesting, I mean, we've talked about that a lot in the way we've looked at the history in the city, but this to me, as we're sitting here on Veterans Day, becomes, right, when we're thinking about what to do, this is what we should do. And again, they are in this trajectory of young women who are the backbone of the first industrial revolution in the country in the 1830s and 1840s. Now, 100 years later, we have this other, collection of pioneer women who get into all of this work. And it's funny because, again, the way you sort of see the history, when I was in grad school and left because I had a house fire and lost all my research, I said, okay, I'm going to go to work. I never thought I would end up doing what I'm doing now. And I ended up working in this factory in Springfield, American Bosch it was called. At the time of the Second World War, it was actually a German-owned company, and the American government occupied it and kicked the Germans out when the war started.
Oh, wow.
And the first job I had when I got there was a woman there who was probably in her early 60s. And I was working in a group, and she was the group leader. And as I got to know her, I told her that I had been a history student or whatever, and she said, I've got stories. And she started telling me about being one of these women that worked in this factory with all these other women. And she was one of the few that refused to quit.
Wow, so she didn't sign that contract.
No, she refused to leave, and she would get periodically laid off and rehired because it was a union contract and seniority mattered, and eventually she ended up working there all these years later.
Wow. And
so she started in 43 or 44, and she was still there in the 70s when I was working there. But she had started as like a young, a young woman right out of high school because it was a job where she could make a lot of money.
Yeah.
And so she told me the story of all these women that had been working, doing all this work at Bosch when, during the Second World War. And I never forgot, her telling me these really interesting stories. And she was bitter in a way because she felt like nobody ever really respected like what women did during that period of time. And so then I thought, okay, well, later I would teach it. So but again, what's interesting is I would always teach this stuff, a mile from here on South Campus at UMass Lowell, but I had never actually thought about Lowell.
Right.
And then I was asked to give a talk about silk and silk manufacturing in Lowell by the Quilt Museum last summer. And I said, all right, so now I got to do some research. And all of a sudden I start reading these articles about the parachute company and thinking, yeah, okay, this is Lowell.
Yeah.
Right? This is how you end up learning things. You get a challenge and then you poke and then you poke a little bit more and then there you go. And you find, again, right next door to where we're sitting this morning,
wow,
this factory making parachutes. Around the corner where Kerouac Park is now, there was a gigantic factory there that sat on the land before the mill was taken down and the park was built. There was a shoe factory in there that was doing boots for the war effort. There was a factory over near where the university's conference center is now that was making wool blankets.
Wow.
And other things for the war. And so it's all over. It's all over the city.
Yes.
And again, it's just sort of hidden away. And even when we do talk about Veterans Day, or the Lowell Sun will write an article, or people will reminisce in some way or have a talk or a conversation, very rarely is this the centerpiece.
Right. And the thing too, like speaking of Veterans Day, one thing that came to mind when you were talking was how we treat veterans. Apparently we have a history of not treating them so well.
Yes, we do have that history.
Yeah, and then on top of that, not recognizing that everybody who participated in these war efforts, these women who we have just forgotten, or like that one woman which is so incredible that you even got to work with her and got that oral story, and who knew you would end up in your field working at a factory, because that's just bizarre and that's just how your life works. But it makes me wonder how we've treated veterans this whole time, how we treat women as veterans, and anybody who's not a man, right, as veterans, and who contribute to this nation's safety and this nation's peace.
And we talk a good game, right? On a holiday like this, we talk a good game, but then something like the bonus army happens.
Right.
And the military turns on the military. It's there, right? It's there for the seeing if people want to poke at it and find it. And for me, now I'm somewhat on a mission to try to find out more about what happened.
This always makes me so interested in economics, but we won't go down that road either.
Yeah, well, I have economist friends. If we want to go that way, then I would bring them in here.
That'd be interesting, just to see, how things might be different if people were honored and respected in the way that they should have been for their work, right? Wow, I feel like there's so much more to know.
Yeah, we've scratched again the surface.
Just the surface, but at least now we know about the bonus army, which is super important. We know Edith Nourse Rogers. Edith Nourse Rogers from Lowell, an incredible woman. So everybody go look that up. Look those two things up. You have homework, and we'll catch you next time on History in Lowell.